So during the course of his presidency, Abraham Lincoln learned to use public letters as a way to communicate directly to the people. And one of the most important of his public letters was addressed to people in Kentucky. It was from 1864. The letter was actually addressed to a Kentucky newspaper editor named Albert Hodges from Frankfort on April 4th, 1864. And Lincoln begins by saying, "You asked me to put in writing the substance of what I verbally said the other day, in your presence and in the presence of other Kentucky politicians who were Unionists, but concerned about the nature of how the emancipation policy and the civil liberties policies had affected the North and the Union." And so what Lincoln does now is he, in effect, summarizes how the war has changed him and where he stands. And it's a very compact description of his policy evolution. He begins by writing, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." Most Lincoln historians think he's being sincere here. This is not just political speak during a campaign. This is a presidential election year, and Lincoln is writing to a swing state, a key state that's part of the Union. But he's addressing to them a blunt truth that most voters in Kentucky, white men, are not going to want to hear necessarily. But then he says, "And yet I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. It was in the oath I took that I would, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I could not take the office without taking the oath. Nor was it in my view that I might take an oath to get power and break the oath in using the power. I understood, too, that in ordinary civil administration this oath forbade me to practically indulge my primary abstract judgment on the moral question of slavery." This is, for Lincoln, very critical. He has personal views and then public duties, and they can be different. He admits to the personal views, but defines his public duties by quoting from the oath he took when he was inaugurated as president. "I had publicly declared this many times and in many ways." And now, of course, he's referring to the most famous public letter he ever wrote, the open letter to Horace Greeley in August of 1862. "And I aver that to this day I have done no official act in mere deference to my abstract judgment and feeling on slavery." So you see how subtle this is. Even though he began by condemning slavery as wrong and saying he was always naturally anti-slavery, he is now explaining to a Kentucky audience that this is true, but it doesn't explain anything he's done as president. "I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution to the best of my ability imposed upon me the duty of preserving by every indispensable means that government, that nation," he says, "of which the Constitution was the organic law." And now here he's broadening the discussion. Every possible means includes not only the emancipation of slaves, but also the suspension of civil liberties. He says, "Was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? By general law, life and limb must be protected, yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life. But a life is never wisely given to save a limb." This is Lincoln at his argumentative best, using a profound but simple question to drive home a key point. But notice what he does in the next sentence. He says, "I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation." The one thing Lincoln never does is acknowledge or admit or concede that he intentionally violated the Constitution. He does not think commanders-in-chief or presidents should do that. He does think, however, that measures otherwise unconstitutional could become so. They could change in a time of extreme crisis. Invasion or rebellion, for example, when it came to suspending civil liberties, or military necessity when it comes to freeing slaves, seizing property. "Right or wrong," Lincoln writes, "I assume this ground and now avow it. I could not feel that to the best of my ability I had even tried to preserve the Constitution if to save slavery or any minor matter I should permit the wreck of government, country, and Constitution altogether. Right or wrong, Lincoln says, I assume this ground. This is his position. He's arguing it in a series of public letters and statements, and it's up for the people to decide in the election. And then he describes how this all came about. When, early in the war, General John Fremont attempted military emancipation, I forbade it, because I did not think it an indispensable necessity. When, a little later, General Cameron, this is Simon Cameron, then Secretary of War, suggested arming the blacks, I objected, because I did not yet think it an indispensable necessity. When, still later, General David Hunter attempted military emancipation, I again forbade it, because I did not yet think the indispensable necessity had yet come. Now, this is only one version of the narrative, and it leaves out an awful lot, but it emphasizes how reluctant Lincoln was to be aggressive about emancipating slaves, how cautious he was. You could argue that he wasn't as cautious as he sounds here, that these are more complicated issues than he's allowing at this moment, but it helps explain what he was about to do following all of this. He says, when in March and May and July of 1862, I made earnest and successive appeals to the border states, Kentucky, to favor compensated emancipation, I believed the indispensable necessity for military emancipation and arming blacks would come unless averted. They declined the proposition, and I was in my best judgment driven to the alternative, and this is the stark choice Lincoln says he faced, of either surrendering the Union and with it the Constitution, or laying a strong hand upon the colored element, and I chose the latter. In choosing it, I hoped for greater gain than loss, but of this I was not entirely confident. Lincoln lays out what he considers to be a moderate case for how he came to emancipate the slaves and enroll them, enlist former slaves into the Union Army. And he's hoping that Kentucky voters will see this as reasonable. More than a year of trial now shows no loss by it in our foreign relations, none in our home popular sentiment, and none in our white military force. No loss by it anyhow or anywhere, he writes. On the contrary, it shows a gain of 130,000 soldiers, seamen, and laborers. There would be more to come. This is only April of '64. These are palpable facts, he wrote, real facts, about which, as facts, there can be no cavilling or arguing. We have the men, and we could not have had them without the measure. Now he is driving home a point in a very practical way. And now he says, let any Union man who complains of the measure, emancipation or the suspension of civil liberties, test himself by writing down in one line that he is for subduing the rebellion by force of arms, and in the next he is for taking these 130,000 men and placing them where they would be but for the measure he condemns. If he cannot face his case, it is only because he cannot face the truth. This is a great lawyer, a great politician, and a very effective argument. It's not going to move everybody in Kentucky, but it is powerful. I add a word, which Lincoln says was not in our verbal conversation. This is also a revealing sentiment. Lincoln says, in telling this tale, I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity or wisdom. And this is important. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. You could read this as a kind of fatalism, or maybe passivity. I think what Lincoln is saying here, though, if you read behind the lines, is that you don't control events as a human being, but you can control your reaction to them. And this is what leaders do. Now, at the end of 3 years of struggle, the nation's condition is not what either party or any man devised or expected. God alone can claim it. Whether it is tending seems plain, meaning that things are looking better for the Union, better but not over. If God now wills the removal of a great wrong, and wills also that we of the North, as well as you of the South, shall pay fairly for our complicity in that wrong, and these are words he's going to echo again a year later when he gives his famous second inaugural address, impartial history will find therein new cause to attest and revere the justice and goodness of God. Lincoln has reached the stage in his presidency where he can be both argumentative and lawyerly, where he can be both personal and direct, and where he can also be kind of profound, solemn, almost religious. He's combined them all, these elements, in his greatest public writings. He wasn't always capable of this. At least he didn't show it fully. But here at Gettysburg in the second inaugural address, he begins to show the depth and range of his talents as a public leader. And that's why the Hodges letter in 1864 deserves to be considered one of Lincoln's greatest documents.